Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, did you hear about this boar that stole a laptop bag from a nudist sunbather in Berlin?
You know, it says something, I think, sad about me that my first reaction to this story was, he's not wearing a mask.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, but did he get the laptop? I was like, it could have gone either way with you.
Yeah, I could think of a couple places he could have used a mask for a little coverage. But he didn't have any.
You know what? He was proudly bare. It's a whole movement in Germany. You know, he was very proud to be there, so we don't need to shame him. I mean, maybe mask shame him, but not otherwise.
No shame, and no shame in you joining us, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll have an extended chat with Sidewalk software engineer Samara Trilling about the trouble with mortgage algorithms. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at the future of consumer culture and a landmark zoning reform in Portland.
All right, let's get to that first story.
All right, that first story, it's a long read from the New Republic, and its author and UK historian Frank Trentman, who's writing about how COVID is completely reconfiguring how we choose to spend our money, with big implications for urban life. Mm-hmm. Vanessa, give us the 3-penny tour of this story.
3 pence, I suppose. So to give you some context, so this is, as you said, a very long read. It's about 30 minutes, but it is worth reading. And it's a pretty provocative read by Frank Trentman. And he does bring up a lot of facets, which we're not going to get to all of them today, but we're going to focus on a few. So the premise basically is that, you know, the coronavirus has been so disruptive that he says it's going to do more than take a few $1,000s out of the pocket of the average customer this year. Rather, it's shaking the foundations on which modern consumer culture has been built over the last 500 years.
Right, and a lot of that foundation he focuses on is in cities, yes. Right? These are the beating hearts of consumer culture, as he calls them, and they have been, as we know and we've discussed before, the hardest hit by the lockdowns and the social distancing practices.
Yeah, and so Trentman does spend some time talking about cities and thinking about their futures potentially, and also talking about the acceleration of some trends potentially in cities. So I'll mention 3 that he brings up. So first of all, he talks about a push for the democratization of consumer goods and services. So the opera or a symphony. So maybe before you couldn't necessarily afford to go to one of those kind of cultural performances, but now they're getting streamed online for a much lower cost. It's available to more people, and that's great. But the downside that he potentially brings up is he could see a future where only the wealthy can access the quote unquote real thing in real life, where they can safely socially distance.
Right, like if a few people are allowed in, right.
Exactly. And then the masses will only get the digital option. And he says, you know, we're kind of in danger of a 2-class system of culture consumption, where you have digital galas for the many and then the real for the few. So that was an interesting point. Second, he refers to a kind of class distinction that could result from the way that we live in our living situations. And he's clearly evaluating our current moment through a Marxist lens. I'm just going to give a heads up to the listeners here. So he has this really funny moment where he imagines a future cottagariat who have access to their spare homes or spare cottages or whatever, and the space to distance, and a claustrophobiat who are stuck in small apartments without outdoor spaces. And then the kicker, which I thought was pretty funny, was he said, well, there's also probably going to be a balconariat, which is, you know, the new petite bourgeoisie.
Yeah, we're deep in the Marxism there.
Yeah. And thirdly, he looked at the accelerated uptick in e-commerce and the downturn for physical retailers. But at the same time, he also sees this renaissance happening with local shops. And he writes, we may be seeing a new emerging symbiosis between the big platform providers such as Amazon and lots of small, flexible shops, diffusion matched with decentralization.
Yeah. I mean, there is something in here to debate, you know, whichever way you lean, really. I think that's what part of the beauty of this piece is. Some of the framing is definitely too Marxist for my taste. I'm much less concerned with the rise of, let's say, a small cottagariat than I am concerned with a big general move out of the city and into the suburbs that reduces the vitality of urban life, the sustainability that only cities provide, the economic opportunity that only cities have historically provided. That is, you know, let's hope that's not in the future, but it's a definite possibility if cities can't, you know, support their essential services and they can't make people feel comfortable with the proximity that has drawn so many people to cities in the past. But in some sense, I think the underlying question that Trentman is getting to here is really the question of how much of our lives are we willing to live online, right? Are parents okay with remote schooling? Are businesses okay with remote work? And if the answer is yes, or like yes, a lot more than in the past, then we have a different conversation, and closing the digital divide becomes more important for cities than ever, maybe even job one for cities.
Yeah, I mean, obviously closing that digital divide is super important, but I do want to think about this question that you're raising here. How much are we willing to live online? Because I think it does relate to Trentman's final point, which I found pretty intriguing. He says that we generally think about consumption as an output. We work, we get paid, and then we buy. But he says you've got to remember it's also an input, and it changes the way we live and work. And right now, it is changing the way we live and work. And as a historian, he reminds us that, we shouldn't hold on to this idea that we're just going to bounce back to an old normal. He points out there's been a lot of new normals that have happened over the past 1,500 years. And after this level of disruption, that's probably where we're headed.
And you see cities asking the really important question here, which is, do we want to rebound to that old normal, or do we want to take this opportunity to kind of set a new direction? And we're seeing that with the approaches some cities are taking to reimagining street design and, maybe thinking about how to allocate public spaces and maybe even what requirements for outdoor space to make in new development. So I think the question really is kind of, can cities continue to push this momentum to a new direction forward and help address some of the challenges that the pandemic has laid bare, but that already existed in cities, from affordability to social equity and more?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, the second top story, and our last one for today, comes from Laura Bliss at Bloomberg City Lab, and she's writing about how Portland just passed a landmark zoning reform that could be a major boost for housing affordability. Eric, this sounds like great news. What happened in Portland?
It really does sound like great news. And in fact, one housing advocate that's quoted in this piece by Laura Bliss called it, quote, the most pro-housing reform to low-density zones in U.S. history.
All right.
So that's no mean feat there.
Yeah.
And let's unpack it a little bit. You've got Portland that, like most U.S. cities, really designates an enormous amount of its land for single-family homes, and only for single-family homes, right? We've discussed this many times on the show before, but there is a type of zoning that only allows developers to build single-family homes. That makes it harder to create more housing options at different price points for a wider range of people.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like 70% of residential land in Portland is zoned for single-family homes. So that is
70%.
Yeah, that's a huge amount.
It's a huge amount.
Or I should say was zoned.
Yeah, right. That's right. Hopefully past tense here.
Yeah.
And this week, the city council approved what it's calling a residential infill project. It's got the unfortunate acronym of the RIP project, but it should be hopefully a new life for the city instead of the death of the city. Yeah. And the change makes it legal to build up to 4 homes on just about any residential lot. And what that means altogether is that developers in Portland who used to be able to only build a single-family home on a lot can now create duplexes, backyard cottages, basement apartments, basically smaller living options that can be more affordable.
Yeah, and we've talked about that kind of housing on the show before as, quote, missing middle housing, right? These are the types of housing options that are available to those in a middle income bracket, which is really important because folks in that bracket right now, often can't afford to pay full market rates. At the same time, they're not eligible for more traditional affordable housing subsidies or programs. So really important to folks on the bracket. That said, the new rule actually does help lower income households too. It looks like developers can build even more units, up to 6, I think, if half are priced at below market rates, which is great.
Yeah, and there's a couple other aspects of this that are very important that I think, we should mention here that make it even more powerful, this RIP rule that Portland's passed, even more powerful than similar efforts we've seen in places like Minneapolis and that we've talked about before. One is what Laura Bliss calls a sliding size cap. And what that basically means is that multifamily buildings can occupy more of an actual lot than a single family home could. So that means you can build more on the same site than you would have been able to in the past. That's one of the aspects that's important. The second, which I think is probably even more important, is that these changes are what they call in the real estate world by right. And that just means developers can do them without going through neighborhood design reviews that often can end up blocking new developments that would result in more affordability and more options. So all around, lots of promising change here.
And the city is really hoping that this will improve equity in addition to affordability, and potentially ease tension around displacement of residents. Laura Bliss wrote that, this RIP rule could potentially reduce displacement for vulnerable renters up to 28%, which would be great if that's the result. It also has the potential to correct some of the injustices of the past. I mean, Portland's single-family zoning rule, it goes back to 1924, and there was a 2019 report showing how, over the decades, it has actually perpetuated racial segregation in the city. I mean, Portland's not alone in that. A lot of U.S. cities have unfortunately perpetuated that segregation. So the new rule doesn't guarantee that things are going to get better, but it is an encouraging step toward expanding housing opportunity. And the great thing too is that Portland is really riding the coattails of other cities that have similarly done that kind of due diligence and are pushing the needle here in terms of equity and affordability. So good on Portland.
Right. And it seems to be even kind of going beyond what some of those earlier attempts have done. And that's what you want to see, right? Cities share information with each other all the time, policy information, all types of innovations. That seems to be happening here, where Portland has built upon what others have done and even gone further.
That's right. Okay, well, that is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. Up next, we're going to talk with Sidewalk's senior software engineer, Samara Trilling. Woo! The S's alliteration there, about a big flaw in mortgage lending algorithms. Back in a sec. We are now joined by software engineer Samara Trilling, who wrote an op-ed arguing that we need to temporarily ban collecting data on mortgage loans during the pandemic, for reasons that we're going to get into in a little bit with Samara. So Samara, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Samara, thank you for joining us. This was a really fascinating op-ed, and it was based on a report you worked on for the Aspen Tech Policy Hub on algorithms in housing loans. Just wanted to ask, you're a software engineer by trade. That's your job here at Sidewalk. What made you want to dive into tech policy generally and maybe housing loans specifically?
Yeah, so growing up, my family actually never owned our own house, and that was always a goal of mine to own my own home. So I started doing some research about mortgages and found a couple of articles stating an interesting conclusion statistically that women tend to pay more for mortgages, but we actually pay them back more reliably than our counterparts. And this was something that was really interesting to me. You'd think that, for banks, they'd want to make sure that their mortgage decisions are accurately tracking how often people pay them back. And it actually seemed pretty unfair to me. For banks, it's a really great deal because they can charge women higher interest rates, will still pay back the mortgage. And this actually isn't just true for women. People in general with thin credit histories, people who live in areas where there aren't as many financial services options, also get charged higher rates. And so my conclusion was, okay, our current mortgage system is unfair. And as a software engineer, you would actually think that the rise of machine learning lending would make that discrimination worse. That's something we've heard a lot about, how machine learning algorithms that are trained on imperfect or biased data can perpetuate that bias. But lending algorithms have a key difference in that they are actually way more consistent in their decisions than human loan officers. So they have the potential to be less discriminatory than these in-person lending officers. But these algorithms will actually only be better if we hold them to really statistically rigorous standards of fairness. And as a software engineer, I got really excited. If we're really intentional about defining the kind of fairness we want to see, this is a problem that technology can actually help solve.
Why did mortgage lenders start using these machine learning algorithms in the first place? What are the benefits that come from them and the drawbacks?
Absolutely. The reason why mortgage lenders want to use machine learning algorithms is similar to why anybody wants to use automation. That's it's faster and it's cheaper.
Right.
And the kind of problem that you are looking for when you want to see if you can use a machine learning algorithm is, are you trying to learn from past data about a person to predict something in the future? And that is very similar to what it looks like to make a mortgage decision. You look at whether the person has been able to pay back their loans in the past, and you make a prediction about whether they can in the future. And you also look at whether they look like other people who've paid back their loans in the past.
And so is that a benefit or a drawback?
So that's a benefit. Normally, if you're going to make a change in your lending policy, you would have to push that out to every single bank branch, you'd have to explain to people what the difference is. And humans are not as good at accepting and changing their behavior as quickly as computers are. So if you want to make a small change to your policy, it's much easier to tell a bunch of machines to do that than it is to tell a bunch of humans. But the drawbacks there really come from, I just said how it's much easier for you to change your policy very quickly.
Right.
And the algorithms are much more reliable than people are. That means that if you have a small error, if you have a bug in your code, or if you have a biased result, that will also be much more consistent, be propagated against, across the entire system in a way that the variability of humans might actually mitigate for you.
Right.
So in this case, humans are a benefit and a drawback.
Right.
So let's get into that a little more. This part of your op-ed I thought was really fascinating. You were writing that, a lending algorithm doesn't just impact someone who might be suffering from economic hardship right now. It really shapes the landscape for people who will be taking out mortgages in the future who just might have a similar kind of profile. Can you unpack this element a little more?
Absolutely. So when we talk about what an algorithm is doing, what's a machine learning algorithm? What does it look like? It looks at a bunch of examples from the past that says, here's this person, here's where they live, here is their current credit score, here are times when they paid back their loans in the past, have they ever had a loan that was delinquent in the past? And it looks at thousands or millions of examples from the past with here's the person's credit history, and here is whether or not they paid back their mortgage, right? So that is your result. And if you have a bunch of pairs of somebody's credit history, somebody's characteristics, and the result, whether or not they paid back their mortgage, then you can use that to train an algorithm. In the current crisis, what we're looking at is a lot of the people who are going to be defaulting on their mortgages during this time are people who maybe were in particular jobs that got really hard hit by the pandemic. And that's people who, are freelancers, people who are restaurant workers, people who have often fewer job protections. Those are people who are often at higher risk of default if you cut out the stream of income that would normally come from a job that you had pre-pandemic. And so the worry is now we've got a whole bunch of new examples of people who have these characteristics of folks who were initially, less protected by our sort of current economy and job conditions. And then we have examples of them not paying back their mortgages. And if you fed that back to a machine learning algorithm and asked it to learn from that, what we'd have in the future is an algorithm that would be unfairly biased, or it would be paranoid and be scared that anybody who looks like a freelancer, a restaurant worker, or somebody who has lower job protections, they would not pay back their mortgage in the future. And that's just not true, right? These are extraordinary circumstances we're living in. It's definitely not these people's faults. They're integral parts of our society. And there's no way that our future algorithms should be prejudiced against people who look like that.
Yeah. And you had a great quote in the op-ed too that I'm just going to read. It's guilt by association. If you look like someone who defaulted in the past, you could get denied a loan, even if you've personally never missed a payment. And I think that really made that point sink in for me.
Absolutely. And that's true for zip code too, right? If you live in a zip code where a lot of your neighbors, they don't have great financial services options for whatever reason, and folks around you have home values near you are lower. And we looked at this historically with redlining. It doesn't matter what your personal history is, you could be expected to have the same outcomes as people around you, even if that's not true for you.
Yeah, it's a great point. So let's get into the solution that you offer. You say, we should ban lending algorithms from using default data during the pandemic in any future mortgage decisions. Sounds like it makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to kind of understand some of the nuance here, because I know that the government has deferred payments already on certain mortgage payments. So why isn't that enough? Why do you need that kind of extra step of banning the lending algorithms from using this data?
Great question, Vanessa. Yeah, so if we actually perfectly implemented this forbearance, if everybody could easily defer their payments, if that were implemented across the board, and you had nobody who defaulted on their mortgage just because of the pandemic, amazing. We have no problem. Sadly, that is not the case. The way that a lot of the forbearance was rolled out was not super consistent across banks. It's often not been easy for individuals to figure out whether they qualify for forbearance. And there's been a lot of stories of folks who deferred their payments for, say, 6 months back when we thought that this might all be over by September. And now if those things are coming due, people aren't any better off than they were back then. And so those initial measures just haven't gone far enough to be able to protect people in the long run. The other part of that is there's still no guarantee that you wouldn't have data about the fact that you participated in a forbearance program logged about you and used in the future. So even if you didn't default, the fact that you used a forbearance program might still be used against you. And that's not something that we want to happen either.
All right. Last one for you, Samara, and we'll let you go. Beyond the example of mortgage lending, your Aspen Tech report explored, a number of other ways that housing algorithms can be fairer, kind of more broadly speaking. Can you talk about some of the policy or tech changes that could create this fairer algorithm in the future?
For sure. One of the things that I'm most excited about is changing our fairness definitions to work for machine learning algorithms so that we don't depend on having a fair lending officer be able to go into a bank once a year and look at all of the records and decide whether or not there is some biased action sort of happening here. This should be something that should be as easy as if you have a program, you should be able to run an automated test on it every single time you push changes to your program, to your code, and that should automatically give you a result about whether or not you're complying with fairness tests. That's something that regulators could implement. So that combination of a new fairness definition that works for algorithms and an automated test that checks every time you change your code whether you're compliant with that new fairness definition is a really exciting opportunity that I think a lot of regulators could benefit from if we have this new fairness definition. One that there's a couple that I think are really good that look at the error rate. So are you making wrong decisions for certain groups of people more often than you make wrong decisions for other groups? And that goes back to my first point, which was, if we're giving women higher interest rates on average, but they're paying back their mortgages more reliably, then if you look at how often you misclassify a woman as being high risk when she's not high risk, that new fairness definition that looks at that misclassification would help solve that problem.
It sounds really promising to me.
Yeah.
This sounds great. Thank you, Samara.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what had you smiling?
All right, my last smile comes from the Axios Future newsletter, written by Brian Walsh, and one of the issues had a segment on predictions about the future from the Rand Corporation back in 1964. So it's always fun to look back at predictions about the future and see just how wrong they got.
All right.
Because that's usually what happens. One of them, in this case, actually kind of came close to being true here. Rand predicted some type of hub for widely accessible information that was retrievable by just about anyone. That's kind of similar to what the internet became. And I think most of the predictions, however, did not come true. These included human-machine symbiosis, telepathy, and time travel through induced comas. I don't know about you. I'm not doing any of that just quite yet.
I don't know. I feel like you could describe this COVID time as time travel through induced coma.
I wish we could induce a coma that goes back to the start of 2020 here. That's
Lord.
A very good point.
Yes.
What had you smiling?
My last smile pick comes from Julia Hollingsworth at CNN, and she was writing about this gentleman in New Zealand who gets paid $10,000 a year to be the city's official wizard. Yes, boy. Ian Brackenbury. He even has a driver's license issued to the wizard. He performs in a public square in front of Christchurch Cathedral. He kind of pontificates on life theories. He wears wizard robes. He has a 4-star rating on TripAdvisor, which is good. And he's now 87, but he already has an apprentice who's ready to take his place. So the wizard will live on in New Zealand.
Every city needs a wizard.
Yeah, that should be a line item in budgets.
Well, time is up, folks. Thank you for joining us this magical week.
Yes, if you want to read the stories we discussed today and many more, then you should sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, let us know. Send an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This episode was edited by Zach McNeese. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. We'll see you next time.
Bye.